The Pacific Northwest is a place people associate with calm mornings, endless green forests, quiet highways, and rain that never seems to stop. But beneath that beauty lies something far more unsettling. This is a region where people have vanished without a trace, where crimes were hidden by fog and time, and where entire communities were left wondering what really happened once the searchlights were turned off. Some of the darkest cases in American history didn't happen in big cities under bright lights. They happened here, in small towns surrounded by trees, where silence can be more terrifying than screams. Tonight, we're stepping into that silence. We're talking about 5 cases so disturbing that investigators still struggle to explain them. Cases where bodies were never found, evidence disappeared, and answers were buried deep in the wilderness. These aren't just stories from police files. They're reminders that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it blends in, waits patiently, and vanishes without leaving footprints behind. As we uncover these 5 dark cases from the Pacific Northwest, remember this: every location you'll hear about looks peaceful in daylight, and every case began like an ordinary day. But by the time night fell, lives were changed forever, and in some cases, the truth was lost in the shadows, where it may remain for good. The first case begins in the deep forests of Washington, where the trees grow so close together that sunlight barely reaches the ground, and sound seems to disappear after just a few steps inside. And it was in this place that a young woman set out on what was supposed to be a short, familiar walk. The kind of walk she had taken dozens of times before without fear or hesitation, telling her family she would be back before dinner, leaving behind nothing but an open door and a promise that would never be kept. Because when night fell and she didn't return, the search began immediately. Neighbors forming lines, dogs tracking scents that abruptly vanished, helicopters scanning endless green canopies that revealed nothing at all. And what disturbed investigators most was not what they found, but what they didn't. No signs of a struggle, no personal items, no blood, no clear direction. Only footprints leading deeper into the woods and then stopping suddenly as if she had simply ceased to exist. And days turned into weeks as the forest swallowed every effort made to reclaim her. Rumors spreading that someone had been watching, that the woods were not empty, that someone knew how to disappear bodies so completely that even trained professionals stood powerless. And years later, when hikers reported finding objects that hadn't been there before, clothing, jewelry, items that could not be confirmed as hers, the case only grew darker, because it suggested something far worse than an accident, something calculated, something patient, something that waited until everyone stopped looking and the family never received answers. Only silence and the unbearable weight of not knowing whether she suffered, whether she called out, or whether she was still out there somewhere beneath the roots of the forest that refuses to give up its secrets. The second case takes us south into Oregon, to a roadside motel where travelers came and went unnoticed, and no one asked questions as long as the rooms were paid for. And it was in one of these rooms that a man was found dead under circumstances authorities were quick to label a suicide. Yet nothing about the scene made sense. The position of the body, the lack of residue, the rearranged furniture, and the missing hours in the timeline all pointed to something being staged rather than spontaneous. And when surveillance footage was reviewed, a figure was seen entering the room during the night, staying briefly, and leaving without ever being identified, a detail that was quietly dismissed and eventually ignored because pushing further would have meant reopening doors some people didn't want opened, and former investigators later admitted, off the record, that the case was closed too quickly. That pressure came from above, that paperwork didn't match reality, and that the man's family was left with a ruling that never explained how or why their loved one truly died. Only that the system had decided it was easier to move on, leaving behind a room that continued to change hands while the truth remained trapped in that single night, frozen in time, waiting for someone brave enough to ask the questions no one wanted answered. The third case is perhaps the most unsettling of all, because it involves not one person, but an entire family who disappeared from their rural, Idaho home in the middle of a stormy night, a place so remote that neighbors were miles away and the nearest town barely registered on a map. And when relatives came to check on them days later, everything appeared normal on the surface. Cars parked neatly outside, food left on the table, lights turned off as if they had simply gone to bed. But there was no sign of the family anywhere. No notes, no packed bags, no financial activity. No distress calls, and investigators were left with a haunting question. How does an entire family vanish without alerting anyone, without leaving even the smallest trace? And theories flooded in, ranging from witness protection to cult involvement to something far darker. Yet none explained the total absence of evidence. And locals whispered that the land itself was cursed, that people who lived too close to it never stayed long, that the ground had claimed others before. And as years passed with no discoveries, the house remained untouched, abandoned, standing as a silent reminder that sometimes disappearance doesn't look violent. Sometimes it looks peaceful, organized, and terrifyingly complete. The fourth case drags us back into the shadows of the 1980s, when multiple victims began appearing across the Pacific Northwest, scattered across different jurisdictions, different towns, and different circumstances, but sharing injuries and patterns that suggested a single hand behind them all. And at the time, authorities refused to connect the dots, insisting the cases were unrelated, isolated, and coincidental. But families noticed similarities, journalists raised concerns, and slowly, a pattern emerged that could no longer be denied. Yet by the time the possibility of a serial predator was taken seriously, the trail had gone cold, evidence degraded, witnesses moved away or died, and any chance of identifying the killer slipped through the cracks created by denial and delay, leaving behind a terrifying possibility that the person responsible was never caught, never punished, and may have simply stopped when the attention grew too close, blending back into society, unnoticed, carrying secrets no one will ever extract. The fifth and final case takes us to a coastal town where the ocean meets silence and storms wash away more than footprints, where a young woman was murdered under circumstances so sensitive that the investigation was sealed, records hidden, and witnesses sworn into silence. And as years passed, attempts to reopen the case were met with resistance, intimidation, and unexplained threats, suggesting that the truth wasn't just painful, it was dangerous. And journalists who pushed too hard found themselves blocked at every turn, told some stories were better left buried. And to this day, the case remains locked away, officially unresolved, but unofficially known by those who refuse to forget, because when a system works harder to hide answers than to find them, it raises a chilling question about who is being protected and why. And when you step back and look at all five cases together, a pattern emerges that goes beyond geography or coincidence. A pattern of silence, of unanswered questions, of investigations that ended too soon or never truly began. And the Pacific Northwest, with all its beauty and isolation, becomes more than a backdrop. It becomes an accomplice. A place where darkness can hide indefinitely, where people can vanish without witnesses, and where the truth doesn't just fade, it dissolves, leaving behind families haunted by what they'll never know, and communities forced to live with the unsettling reality that some mysteries aren't unsolved because they impossible, but because solving them would reveal something far worse than anyone is ready to face. And yet, even as time passes, these stories refuse to be forgotten because the absence of resolution creates its own gravity, pulling in the minds of those who dwell in the towns, the forests, and along the rain-slick highways of the Pacific Northwest, where every shadow seems to carry the memory of someone who was once there and is no longer. And families become investigators in their own right, poring over reports, retracing steps, reviewing every possible detail that law enforcement might have missed, questioning neighbors, friends, strangers, even themselves, wondering if something they said, something they ignored, something they failed to notice could have made the difference. And the psychological toll of that uncertainty can be devastating, leaving parents haunted by the constant possibility that their loved ones are suffering somewhere, that they are aware but unable to communicate, or worse, that they are gone, and the world has simply moved on without acknowledging it. And when these feelings are compounded by the physical isolation common to this region, the vast distances between homes, the dense forests, the long stretches of unpopulated land, they magnify into an ever-present sense of vulnerability, a creeping realization that in such spaces, crime can flourish unnoticed, and that the natural environment itself can become an accomplice, concealing evidence, masking sounds, and offering limitless opportunities for those who intend harm to act without detection. And over the decades, law enforcement has repeatedly admitted that cases like these strain resources and patience alike, because every investigation requires manpower, time, and attention. And when a trail grows cold, the decision to prioritize newer cases often means that old files are left dormant. Yet the memories of victims do not fade as easily, lingering in the minds of friends, family, and even strangers who are drawn into the stories by media reports, local gossip, or the occasional resurfacing clue. And this collective memory creates a tension that is almost tangible in towns touched by these tragedies, where residents develop an acute awareness of who walks alone, where they go, and what they do, often sharing stories in hushed tones about missing persons, strange behaviors, or areas considered unsafe after dark. And those stories, passed quietly from person to person, reinforce the sense that the Pacific Northwest is more than just a scenic backdrop. It is a living, breathing entity capable of hiding terrible truths. And in this landscape, the difference between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between safety and danger, can be measured in seconds, in footsteps, or in the fleeting presence of someone watching, someone who knows the paths, the forests, the patterns of human movement, and who exploits them with chilling precision. And when one examines the individual cases, the girl lost in the Washington woods, the man in the Oregon motel room, the entire Idaho family gone overnight, the serial killings that authorities failed to connect, and the sealed case of the coastal town woman, a pattern emerges, one that transcends mere coincidence, one that highlights the fragility of life when confronted by isolation, secrecy, and a justice system that is stretched too thin to protect everyone. And as one digs deeper, it becomes clear that what binds these cases is not geography alone, but the way human behavior interacts with environment, with negligence, with delayed action, and with the quiet complicity of indifference. And this complicity manifests in many forms: dismissed evidence, ignored witnesses, lost files, and the slow erosion of urgency that allows perpetrators to move on without consequence, leaving behind lives suspended in uncertainty, communities fractured by fear, and landscapes forever marked by the absence of those who once walked freely within them. And as time stretches forward, new generations inherit these mysteries, walking the same streets, hiking the same trails, unaware of the shadows that linger, the footsteps that were never traced, the voices that were never heard. And in this way, the stories endure, carried in whispers in newspaper clippings, in unsolved files, and in the imaginations of anyone who dares to learn them, because there is a fascination with the unresolved, a draw toward understanding what cannot be easily explained. And yet, as compelling as it is, that fascination is tempered by an unshakable fear that some truths are meant to remain hidden, and that the search for closure can sometimes place those who seek it in danger, or at the very least leave them with a knowledge of darkness they cannot unsee. And when one considers all 5 cases, together a tapestry of absence, misfortune, and inexplicable events emerges, each thread connected not by intention, but by circumstance, opportunity, and the unforgiving nature of the terrain. And the effect is cumulative. The more one contemplates these events, the more one realizes how vulnerable anyone can be when isolated, when overlooked, when living in an environment that simultaneously nurtures life and conceals death. And the deeper the reflection goes, the more the mind begins to grasp the subtle horror that what makes the Pacific Northwest beautiful, the endless trees, the fog, the quiet, is also what makes it frightening, because in places where no one is watching and where time can erase the smallest detail, crimes can occur people can vanish and answers can be lost forever. And that is precisely why these 5 cases matter so much. Because they are reminders that mystery is not always created by intent. Sometimes it is created by neglect, by patience, by the environment itself, and by the limits of human perception, and they serve as a warning to anyone living, traveling, or simply passing through this region. That safety is never guaranteed, that the ordinary can turn extraordinary in the blink of an eye, and that the dark undercurrents of the Pacific Northwest flow just beneath the surface, quiet but persistent, patient and eternal, waiting to test those who underestimate it, or to claim those who stray too far from what is known. And as long as these cases remain unsolved, as long as families wait without answers, and as long as the forest and rain continue to conceal secrets, the shadow of these events stretches across the land, touching every corner, every town, every highway, and every mind willing to remember, ensuring that the darkness of the Pacific Northwest is never truly gone, only hidden and always waiting.